Hello, everybody. Just a short little lecture today on some of the things that we've touched on through the semester, but I need to make sure we all understand. One, just ocean circulation. I know I've talked about ocean circulation, but just a couple of different things I need to throw in. And then two, biogeography. And we've talked about biogeography all through the semester. That's how plants and animals adapt to their physical geography. And as you know now, that everything is adaptation to the lithosphere and to the climate, that essentially physical geography, the natural landscapes of the world, are a result of the lithosphere and the climate. That's what we've learned all semester, right? So plants and animals adapt to their topography and to their climate. So let's look and see how they do that. First, we have the quote, "Own only what you can carry with you, no languages, no countries, no people. Let memory be your bag." All right. And so first with ocean currents, I know that I have said in here that the west side of a continent, always a cold ocean current. The east side of a continent, always a warm ocean current. And if you remember, that's because of the Coriolis effect and how water and wind go in a clockwise pattern. Yeah, clockwise north of northern hemisphere and go counterclockwise in the southern hemisphere. And that means that as the water and the wind go along the equator, they get heated up. And if you're in the northern hemisphere, they curve along the east coast, whether it's Asia, whether it's North America, whether it's South America, whether it's Australia, east coast wise, not north hemisphere wise. And then that current makes its way up to, if you're in the northern hemisphere, Alaska. If you're in the southern hemisphere, Antarctica, cools down and then makes its way along the west coast, North America, South America, Western Australia, Western Asia, which we call Europe, and Western Africa, which we call Western Africa. So besides that circulation that's happening with the Coriolis effect and with the ocean currents, we also have water that is going from, and matter and energy and all of that stuff that's going from the surface of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean. So that thermohaline, what we call thermohaline circulation, you have cold, dense waters that sink. So so basically the ocean is both circulating from, let's say in the northern hemisphere, from Alaska down to the equator, back up to Alaska, to the equator, Alaska, equator. You also have from the surface of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean, this other circulation. So just like in air, remember warm air rises, cool air, what does it do? What does cool air do? It sinks. So warm water rises and cool water sinks as well. This helps with the transfer of energy throughout the ocean. So not only do we have the surplus of the sun's energy being collected in the air, we also have it being collected in the water around the equator. And with that warm water, you also have the rising of matter that allows for nutrients and the sun's energy to be passed through different layers of the ocean. So just like we have the circulation of the convection cell up here in the climate with warm air rising, condensing, sinking back, and doing this whole circulation that leads to our seasons around the world and leads to different, climate, what's the word I'm looking for? Climate zones. We also have cold, dense water that sinks to the bottom of the ocean and warm water that rises to the top. And with it, it brings energy, matter. So energy from the sun, and then the matter that is being circulated through the ocean, meaning all of the things that, just like if we look at soil, excuse me, if we take a river system, for example, remember when we talked about the river system and how you have all of these living things in the river system. And as those living things, they ingest different types of energy, right? They're eating stuff that's in the river. They're also pooing out matter, and that poo is absorbed by the trees and the plants and the riparian community along the river channel. So you have that circulation of energy. You have the same thing happening in the ocean. And what is allowing for energy to sink and rise from the top of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean is warm, rises, cool, sinks, just like in the atmosphere. So let's move on to, remember, biogeography is the study of the spatial distribution of plants and animals throughout the world. The word biota refers to plants and animals. Biota, bio meaning life. So an ecosystem is also something I know that you have heard before, but that's a collection of organisms, and they have adapted to the environment that they live in. So if we look at our climates around the world, and we've learned all about the climate now, if we look at our major climates around the world that lead to types of climate, what we call biomes. So if you look around the equator, so if we look around the equator, and remember there's going to be a low pressure cell that leads to warm air rising and condensing and raining, that you then have a biome that correlates to that biome being tropical rainforests. And then if we go 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator, what do we get? Descending warm air, right? We talked about this, all of this in previous lectures. So air around the equator rises and condenses and rains, and then it gets pulled back down to the surface of the earth. Remember, it's dropped all of its water vapor, but it adiabatically heats as it makes its way back to the surface of the earth, pummeling the landscape 20 to 40 degrees north and south of the equator with warm, dry air, leading to our true desert biomes. So we go from there to grasslands, to trees, to tundra. Those are our major biomes in the world. Within those biomes, there are ecosystems. So a biome is a large animal and plant community determined by climate. But then remember, topography is going to change depending on where you are, that even you can be in the tropics, but you might be at high elevation. That's why we have these smaller systems within those biomes that we call ecosystems. Those smaller communities of plants and animals have adapted to local climates as well as the macro climate. So ecosystems adapt to micro as well as macro climates. So they are a subset of a biome. So you could have an ecosystem would be something like a rainforest, like a wetlands, like many of the other places that we've talked about around the world, an orographic desert, the windward side of an island, all of those would have unique ecosystems to those microclimates. So within your ecosystem, you're going to have an ecological niche. That's going to be your place in your ecosystem. Ecosystems are all about a balance. We all have a place in our ecosystem. We're absorbing some energy and we're transferring that energy. So some of us transfer our energy in terms of protein. Some of us transfer our energy in terms of carbon. If you think about it, we're carbon-based. Humans are carbon-based. Living things are carbon-based. When we die and decompose, we decompose and that carbon has to go somewhere. If we die and we're buried, our carbon goes into the soil. If we die and we're burned, we're cremated, our carbon is going to be released into the atmosphere. But there's also a transfer of protein. If you think about how do we transfer protein? How do we transfer protein? By eating animals, right? If you eat animals. So there's our ecological niche refers to our place in our ecosystem, but it also refers to your place and how you're going to contribute to these transfers of carbohydrates, transfers of protein, transfers of carbon. A habitat is a subdivision of the ecosystem that you're in. So you're in a biome, and then you're in an ecosystem, and then you have your habitat in that ecosystem. That is the subdivision, the specific place that you live in your ecosystem. So, when we look at biogeography, we're examining animals and plants and how they've adapted to different parts of the world. And here we have a couple of different habitats: needle-leaf forest, bog, right? Swampy water, basically brackish water, a little bit of salt, is what brackish means. A deciduous forest, that's something that we would see in like Canada or New Zealand or somewhere like that. So when I keep talking about the transfer of energy, I'm referring to the food web, sometimes called the food chain, but it's better to refer to it as a food web because chain suggests something that's linear. And remember, we're in geography, so we're all about a web instead of a linear line. So if we look at our food web, it has to do with the transfer of proteins and carbohydrates within all living things. It's the organization, the network of an ecosystem that allows for this transfer, this energy flow, carbohydrates and proteins being transferred from one organism to another organism to another organism. How do we transfer those things? Mostly by eating things. So eating carbohydrates, eating proteins, that's one of the ways that we transfer energy. But remember, those carbohydrates have to start somewhere. So there's a transfer of energy that has to happen that doesn't really involve eating a living thing. And there's also the sequestering of carbon in soil. That would be a transfer that would eventually be led through this food web. And there is also the decomposition of our living things. So our decomposers also play a part in our food chain, in our food web. So we have all of the things that eat protein and carbohydrates in our food web, but we also have to have the initial creation of carbohydrates, and we also have to have the decomposition of living things to complete that transfer of energy back into the soil that then allows it to circulate again. If you remember that word trophic level, I introduced that word on the very first day of class, and that is the position that an organism occupies within the food web. What are you in the food web? Do you produce carbohydrates? Do you transfer energy? Are you decomposing? That's what that refers to. A trophic level is what role do you play in the transfer of energy inside your ecosystem? Okay, so when we look at our food web, our energy flows through the chain or through the web first. Initially comes from the sun. Here comes the sun, here comes the sun's energy. Plants just straight up eat up the sun's energy. Plants are out there, they've got their leaves all out, they're absorbing the sun. They transfer that sun's energy into carbohydrates. So they are our first trophic level in our food web. And they are producers of carbohydrates. So they take the sun's energy and they recomposition it into carbohydrates. And so then the second trophic level are primary consumers. Those consumers, we also would probably call them herbivores, right? Because they consume only producers. So they're only eating the plants. So the sun gets transferred into carbohydrates by the plants, and then the primary consumers come along and consume that carbohydrate. And then you have the secondary consumers. Those secondary consumers, they eat the food that ate the other food. Does that make sense? So that carbohydrate goes from the sun to the plant, and then the primary consumer comes along and eats that carbohydrate, turns that carbohydrate into protein, and then that protein is transferred from primary consumer to secondary consumer. And then you have a tertiary consumer, and that tertiary consumer is going to eat a whole lot of different things. So that tertiary consumer is going to eat maybe the secondary consumer, maybe the primary consumer, maybe even the producer, depending on if you're a herbivore, a carnivore, or an omnivore. And we as humans are omnivores. We're not the only omnivores. There's many different animals that are omnivores. One good way of telling if you're an omnivore is your teeth. Herbivores, they have flat teeth like we have in the back here to grind up the producers, whereas carnivores have these sharp teeth. If you have a combination of those teeth, then you are an omnivore. So another way of telling is your eyes. A tertiary consumer or even a secondary consumer, their eyes are going to be usually pointing out to the front of their head. They're predators, right? So if you're a predator, you need to be looking ahead all the time. If you are a primary consumer, if you're just an herbivore, not just as in that's, you're less important to this trophic scale because you only eat plants, but if you are not looking to prey on something, if you're an herbivore, you are the prey. So your eyes are going to be on the side of your head. So think about it. One way of telling if an animal is an herbivore versus a carnivore is, are they looking straight ahead so that they can spot their prey? Or are they looking to the side so that they can see who's trying to prey on them? Right? And then we have the decomposers. And the decomposers, they don't really discriminate. They decompose everything. They decompose the producers, the primary consumers, the secondary consumers, the tertiary consumers. Their job is to get in and take those carbohydrates and those proteins and break them back down into their basic carbon level and sequester that into the soil. And then what happens? The primary producers eat up that sequestered carbon that allows them to absorb the sun's light and turn it into carbohydrates. And then the primary consumer comes along, and what do? They take that carbon and that sunlight and they run it through their little bodies. And then here comes the secondary consumer and then the tertiary consumer, and it just keeps going, keeps circling around. Photosynthesis is how those plants take the sun's energy and turn it into a carbohydrate. So it's how they produce carbohydrates. They take water, they take carbon dioxide, they use energy from the sun, they release oxygen, is not so nice of them because then we breathe it in. They sequester carbon into the soil and they become food. So a carbohydrate is a class of organic compound that's made of a little carbon, a little hydrogen, and a little oxygen. Biomass is a word I know that I've said before in class, but it's the weight of living things. So if you talk about the Congo, for example, the Congo right in here has the heaviest biomass in the world, meaning the weight of all the living things in the Congo is the heaviest in the world. That tells you that A, there's a lot of different living things, and B, they're pretty big. Gorillas, giraffes, stuff like that. Whereas if we go over here to the Amazon, again, we have a lot of biomass, but we have more biodiversity. So the Amazon has the most biodiversity in the world. The Congo has the heaviest biomass in the world. And our biogeochemical cycles, this is the carbon cycle. So I've been talking a little bit about the carbon cycle, but also about how carbohydrates are made. Well, in the transfer of carbohydrates and proteins, we also have the transfer of chemicals, of carbon. And so when we see that like I said, we're carbon-based. When we die, we decompose. Decomposers come along and decompose us. I know that in that picture just showed mushrooms, but there's other decomposers, bacteria, for example, that break down your body and your proteins and turn them back into your chemical compound, which is carbon. And so that carbon moves through the soil, through the atmosphere, through the hydrosphere, and all the ways that we've talked about how chemicals transfer. And into the lithosphere too, right? They get pushed back into the lithosphere when we have plate tectonics moving around. It's just constantly transferring. It's all just a transfer of carbohydrates, proteins, and chemicals all around us all the time. Moisture is what some of our decomposers love. You can't have decomposition without a little bit of moisture because bacteria, they love that moisture. So when we're looking at how quickly things break down, if we were to go to like the tropics, there's a lot alive and also there's a lot being broken down because there's so much water vapor in the air. There's a lot of bacteria in the air, and that bacteria allows for the breaking down, the decomposition of all that biomass. All of that biomass that we see in the Congo, all of that biodiversity that we see in the Amazon. And then if we were to go to the desert, like Arizona, and we wanted to start like a compost pile, things would not be composting nearly as quickly as they would in, let's say, from Arizona to North Carolina, because North Carolina is much more humid. There's a lot more water vapor in the air, so there's more bacteria, as opposed to Arizona, where there's not a lot of water vapor in the air, so there's not a lot of bacteria. So basically, things that are decomposing are more likely to dry out from the sun before they properly decompose. They will decompose eventually, but you'll see them there for a lot longer. If you imagine like a compost pile or something like that. What was something else I was going to say? I don't remember if I said this in the beginning of the semester, but one thing that I like to introduce when talking about geography is where spicy food is from. And if you notice, spicy food is from the equator, basically from the tropics. The places, the cultures in the world that have spicy food are from the tropics. And it's interesting because we as humans, we relate culture purely to humans. We don't think about how culture is a response to physical geography, unless you're a geographer, then that's all you think about. But when you look at something like, we think like, oh, people from the tropics are spicy people and they like their food spicy and their blood, et cetera, et cetera. We have all this we have all these character attributes that we put on people depending on what their food is. Instead of looking at something like, what is their physical geography? If you're in the tropics, there's a lot of water vapor in the air. And we just said bacteria loves that water vapor. So if bacteria loves that water vapor, what it means is that there's a lot of things competing to eat your food. You want to eat your food, and bacteria already has the jump on your food and is trying to break down your food. If you ingest that food with a little bit of bacteria on it, what do you get? Sick. So if you spice it up, before you have refrigeration, what you have to do is spice up that food. You make it as spicy as possible because that kills the bacteria that's trying to decompose your food before you even get to eat it and decompose it yourself. You know what I mean? And then if we go to cooler places, there's not bacteria trying to break down their food constantly, so they don't have to spice the crap out of their food. Okay, so one of the places that's the most fun to look at biogeographic adaptation is Australia. Here's Australia, and I circle this because that's where the people basically live. But in Australia, that's where we have things like this, wombats. This is a wombat. A wombat is a type of mammal. So we're mammals. I'm a mammal. I'm warm-blooded. I've got hair. Mammals, warm-blooded, hair, live births, nurse their young. That's what makes us mammals. But there's 3 different types of mammals in the world. So there's mammals on mammals on mammals, right? But there's 3 like major types of mammals. So one is the placental mammal, like me and like you. A placental mammal means that so evolution has everything to do with reproduction. Sometimes we like to think, oh, we're evolving to, like I've heard people say that cancer is an evolutionary trait to keep people from living too long. No, evolution is about adapting to and being able to reproduce. Once you have reproduced, you're not actually very valuable to your species anymore because it's about creating the next generation. So when we look at how we reproduce, we have adapted this fantastic thing called a uterus. A uterus is like a little tin canister that we keep in our bodies, and it grows to hundreds of times its size. It's the only human organ that goes from little tiny to hundreds of times its size. Women's bodies are freaking amazing. Women have, excuse me, the uterus, like I just said, that expands to hundreds of times its size. And they also have the clitoris, which is the only organism that is there purely for pleasure. That's the only thing that it serves to do, is just pleasure. Nothing else has that. So anyway, and you might think like, what about a penis? Hello, you pee out of a penis and ejaculate. I didn't need to say all that, but you know what I mean. All right, so our uteruses are this amazing little like protective device that allows us to protect our fetuses. And so as your fetus is all vulnerable and growing, your uterus expands, it expands, it expands, and it's like this hard little encasement that keeps your fetus nice and cozy and protected. The problem is then it has to come out somehow, and that is a real problem. Trust me, I've been through it. Now, the marsupial is also a mammal. It's one of our 3 types of mammals, and they adapted a little bit differently. So first of all, marsupials are from Australia, and Australia is the first part of Pangaea that broke off. So while there were mammals all together on Pangaea, some mammals evolved a little bit differently because they broke off from other mammals first. So our marsupials over here, instead of having their uterus on the inside, they have it on the outside in a little pouch. And so when they give birth to a fetus. It's like I've seen videos. In fact, I'll post a video on a kangaroo giving birth, and she's like licking her paws, like she doesn't even realize that she's giving birth because it's a fetus. And the fetus comes out of the vaginal canal. They have vaginal canals. And it makes its way and has to climb its way up through the fur and get into the pouch. And once it's in the pouch, it hooks onto a nipple, and it's there for until it's 40 weeks old. Just like a human keeps their fetus in their uterus for 40 weeks. The marsupial keeps their fetus basically in the pouch until it's 40 weeks. And they also have this cool thing with diapause, where if there's a drought, if they have another nursing young, their fetus will actually remain in this state of non-growth until they're out of the drought, until they're out of a famine, and then it'll grow. That's really important for their survival. So the marsupial has their uterus on the outside, and then there's this guy. This is a monotreme. There's only really 2 monotremes in the world. This is one of them. It's called an echidna. An echidna, they're really cute. They burrow. All these animals burrow. And when they walk, they kind of look like they're rolling, you know? So the monotreme is a mammal, hare, warm-blooded, nurses its young, but has an egg. These guys lay eggs. So it's a mammal that lays eggs. The monotreme is a mammal that lays eggs, and then it nurses its young, but they don't have nipples like marsupials and placental animals do. They have just, they lactate and it just oozes out of their fur. And so then the baby comes along and like licks the fur, and that's a monotreme. The other animal that belongs to the monotreme category is this guy. It's a platypus. Platypuses are this whole amalgamation of things. They've got the webbed feet down here, and the webbed feet have claws in them. And they actually, the claws bring out mammalian venom, which is like, there's nothing in the world that can treat mammalian venom. Basically, if you get hit with a shot of mammalian venom, it's going to hurt you for like a week. It's probably not going to kill you, but you can't get rid of it, and you're going to be in pain for like a week. They have the duckbill. They have their furry little beaver bodies. They're monogamous. They have their mate, and they build their little dam together, and then they lay their eggs, and then the egg cracks, and here comes the baby, and it licks the milk off of the mom's fur, and that's their life. So that's biogeography, and that's the transfer of energy and a whole bunch of exciting stuff. I hope you liked that, as well as my little tangent into reproductive organs. All right,